There's a silent, massive experiment happening right now, and chances are you're living right in the middle of it without even realizing you're chained. Governments borrow trillions with the press of a button. Central banks print money out of thin air. Families sign up for 30-year mortgages as casually as buying groceries. We talk as if debt were something normal, harmless, and permanent. It isn't. Global debt, public, private, corporate, household, has quietly exploded past $315 trillion. That is nearly 4 times the size of the entire global economy. No civilization in human history has ever carried a weight like this. Debt is a sleeping predator, harmless while it rests, deadly when it awakens. The real question isn't whether this mountain of global debt will trigger a crisis, but when and who will pay the price. Welcome to Financial Cycles. To understand how we ended up here, we have to look at debt for what it truly is, a mechanism of power. Debt isn't a modern invention. It's older than money itself. The first clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia were ledgers, records of who owed whom. In early societies, priests and kings understood something. Debt is power, but unrestricted debt destroys social order. Ancient rulers declared sweeping jubilees, periodic decrees that erased debts and reset the system. They understood that you cannot enslave an entire population forever. By the Renaissance, debt evolved from grain and cattle into gold and credit. Merchant families like the Medici in Florence financed popes and kings. Look at 16th century Spain. Even while overflowing with silver stolen from the New World, the Spanish crown declared bankruptcy 4 times. Even empires stuffed with gold can drown in debt when it is used to chase geopolitical power. This was history's first major lesson in sovereign leverage. By the 20th century, debt became the fuel of global instability. After World War I, Germany was saddled with crushing reparations. The government turned to the printing press, causing catastrophic hyperinflation. Citizens carried wheelbarrows of paper marks just to buy a single loaf of bread. Then came 1944 and the Bretton Woods Conference. The US dollar was pegged to gold, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. It offered the illusion of permanent stability. But by the late 1960s, burdened by war and domestic spending, Washington printed far more dollars than it held in gold. When foreign nations began demanding physical gold, President Richard Nixon slammed the door in 1971. This was the quiet revolution. Debt was officially untethered. Money was no longer backed by a finite asset. It was backed purely by trust and government decree. Central banks realized they could manipulate interest rates. When growth slowed, they lowered rates to encourage borrowing. When crisis hit, they created more debt. In the 1980s, public debt expanded rapidly. Developing nations borrowed heavily, triggering the devastating Latin American debt crisis when interest rates spiked. The playbook was written: use debt to simulate short-term prosperity, then leave the population stranded when the tide recedes. This mechanism reached its breaking point in 2008. The 2008 crash was not simply about bad housing loans. It was about debt layered upon debt, a vast pyramid of leverage where mortgages were packaged into complex securities, insured with derivatives and amplified by leverage ratios as high as 30-1. When the foundation crumbled, the collapse threatened the entire global banking system. And here lies the bitter irony. Those who leveraged recklessly were rescued with trillions in taxpayer-funded bailouts. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, were left with foreclosures, unemployment, and strict government austerity. Debt was revealed not as a neutral economic instrument, but as a system rigged to protect the powerful. Since then, we have entered the age of surreal numbers. Global debt has tripled in 2 decades, rocketing past $315 trillion. Public debt in Japan stands at over 200% of GDP. In the United States, the national debt routinely blows past $35 trillion. Annual interest payments on U.S. debt alone have now officially surpassed the entire national defense budget, topping $1 trillion. Everywhere you look, debt has metastasized. Why do politicians rely on debt so heavily? Because debt buys time. Raising taxes or cutting spending angers voters. Borrowing creates the illusion of painless prosperity. You get the benefits now. Future generations pay the tab. This is the great lie, that debt is free, infinite, and safe. But leverage works like gravity. It feels weightless on the way up and crushing on the way down. When central banks raised interest rates after 2022, the sleeping predator awakened. Refinancing costs exploded for corporations and mortgage payments surged. Economic history proves that when debt piles up beyond mathematical recovery, there are only 3 escape routes. There are no shortcuts. Option 1, you pay it back honestly. This requires decades of budget surpluses and painful spending cuts. Almost no political system chooses this. Option 2, you restructure or default. Admit the obligations cannot be paid, forcing creditors to accept losses. It brings immediate turmoil and bank panics. Option 3, you inflate it away. Instead of declaring default, central banks print currency to service obligations. The real value of debt shrinks. If prices rise 10%, your cash savings lose 10% of purchasing power. But the government's real debt load also shrinks by 10%. Inflation is a silent, hidden tax on your labor. It quietly drains wealth from citizens who save to preserve a system floating on promises. Debt is not just economics. It is about power. Who lends, who borrows, and who gets rescued when the system cracks? When debt becomes unbearable, the powerful rarely pay. Banks get bailed out. Corporations restructure. Politicians retire. Ordinary people lose homes, savings, and purchasing power. That is why understanding debt is not just financial education, it is survival. You cannot borrow your way to permanent wealth. You cannot print real productivity. You cannot run a global civilization on endless debt without eventually facing a reckoning. Protecting yourself doesn't mean panicking or burying gold in the backyard. It means building real, productive assets, understanding the historical patterns of paper currency, and seeing the trap before you become its next victim. History moves in relentless cycles. Debt accumulates, leaders deny, crises erupt, and societies reset. The only choice you have is whether you face that cycle blind or awake. If this analysis gave you a clearer perspective on the mechanics of global debt, subscribe to Financial Cycles. Leave your thoughts below, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.